digitaljamsessions.com. Hello and welcome to this Digital Jam session. Today we're joined by Marek and Cameron, who are going to explain to you exactly what they do. And I'm going to start with you, Marek. Why don't you explain to us exactly what you do?
Hello. Well, I'm a games writer and narrative designer. I work in the games industry. I've been in the industry for about 11 years now. I got my break working for Atari on a game called Driver Parallel Lines. And since then, I've done all sorts of jobs, mainly story-oriented, working on games like, Bioshock 2, I was an audio director, and I was a writer for games like Borderlands, the pre-sequel, and more recently, I'm at the moment working on Fable Legends with Lionhead Studios, and Killing Floor 2, a game for Tripwire Interactive.
Wonderful, thank you. And Cameron, why don't you explain to us a little bit about your agency?
Hello, yes, my name is Cameron. I'm one of the founders of Sharpens. Sharpens is a business that specialises in connecting stuff to the internet, I guess. We work predominantly with kind of global consumer brands and help them understand how they build more value with consumers in connected environments like homes, bars, stadiums, festivals in the future, etc. So I also do a lot of public speaking on brand behaviour, the Internet of Things, and I guess where the two collide with each other.
Wonderful. So thank you very much for joining us today, gentlemen. And the loose topic that we've pre-agreed for this session today will be somewhere in the general vicinity of storytelling and the future of storytelling in the context of an Internet of Everything world, a connected world where storytelling isn't just confined to one individual device or platform. So I am curious, we're going to start with you, Marek, because I think you've probably got very much a hands-on experience in terms of the evolution of storytelling and maybe where that's changing. And maybe perhaps some of your observations in terms of what that change has been over maybe the last kind of 5 or 10 years. From a storytelling and a story design perspective, do you feel there has been much change to accommodate this idea of multiple connected platforms and multiple connected devices?
That's a huge and tricky question. I would say that it really depends on which way you kind of tackle it, I suppose. I think that, in a sense, I could say that in some ways things have changed from, if you want to really look at it from a very sort of base level in terms of our capacity to tell stories over a digital medium. Like, I'll zero in on, typical game platforms, for example, consoles and PCs and so on and so forth. We have, a higher ability to, graphically and from an audio point of view and from a memory point of view to actually have more convincing stories told from just a purely technical point of view. I would say that from a content point of view, because I was listening to one of your earlier podcasts and people were talking in this sort of area. I think from a content point of view, I think that things are getting better. I would say that 10 years ago, there was less, and it's quite a controversial thing to say, I think, but you'll get this from a lot of games writers. I think there was less appreciation and value put on story than there perhaps is today. Mm-hmm. Now you've got a sort of a really a landscape with a lot of variety in terms of some games companies who really put a lot of stock by it, and some companies that really, when you lift up the cover, you sort of get the sense that they're really about the gameplay and that story comes second. So how have things changed? In some ways, quite a lot, but they're also sort of moving, I would say, a lot more glacially than I would like, given the fact that technology is supposed to be so fast moving. It's an interestingly conservative environment in some ways, partly because there's so much money at play for the big projects. So I'd say in some ways it's moving a lot, in some ways it's not. And that's a terribly vague sort of answer for you.
Don't worry, I'm going to come back to you on this. But first of all, I wanted to ask you, Cameron, from your perspective, working with brands and working in that commercial environment, obviously there has been quite a significant change in terms of the way that people perceive the value of storytelling and the value of having narrative in the development of content. And I'm interested to hear from your perspective how you think that's changed over the last 5 years.
I think that, I guess when we talk about storytelling from a brand perspective, I mean, the proliferation of devices and the availability of, all kind of the variety of digital inventory, the things that you're hearing about now, stuff like programmatic and, sequential content and stuff like that, which is very much talking to a world, I guess, that was built around messaging. So we, previously everything was built around TV advertising, big brand story. Then it was followed up with a banner ad. Then it was followed up with an email. Then it had a big double page spread and stuff. And I guess that as our devices are getting smaller, and sometimes actually the I guess the experience design is almost invisible, that doesn't really lend itself well to a big kind of above the line story piece. So one of the things that we really work with brands is to look at actually how do you behave differently. And how does that build your brand in this more connected world? Because if you look at, so one of the things I do when I'm speaking is I ask the crowd, when was the last time that you appreciated seeing a mobile banner advert pop up? And as you can imagine, there's not that many, it's not that many hands being raised. So I guess what we do is we say, well, actually, instead of telling your story through that big kind of above the line thing, imagine if you could either activate the products that the consumer's buying, and imagine if they became interactive, and imagine if they could tell their story, or look at the space around the product and think about, well, how can I connect that's going to give the consumer a better experience of that space, which is going to drive a new type of value. So, for example, if I'm in a bar environment, how do I unlock a service that means I don't have to queue, or how can I reorder from my table very easily, or all of those sorts of things. So I guess that, in terms of one of the brands, one of the ways that brands can tell stories in a connected world. For example, we're working with a vodka brand that's got a very rich history, and obviously every alcohol brand that you speak to will tell them they have a rich history. But I mean, they produce, so it's Absolute vodka, and they produce 120 million bottles of vodka from one place in Sweden called Skåne, a place called Aarhus. And you say, well, actually, if that bottle, and they're tracking all of that information about that bottle anyway, who made the bottle, was it checked for cracks, when was it filled, who checked the vodka, when did it go into a pallet, when did it go to the retailer, who was it bought, or what retailer did it go to. If you can then say, well, actually, if we can connect this stuff up, and if that bottle can now tell its story of provenance to that consumer, as well as being able to say, hey, I'm a real bottle of vodka, which is a great thing from a brand protection perspective anyway, and why can't it now build its value with the consumer and say, this is my story, and now I want to hear about yours and stuff. So I think the dynamic of storytelling has shifted slightly, where it's not just about pumping messages at people, but it's actually involving them in the storytelling process as well.
It's almost, that's okay, if I can just sort of add, it's interesting you say that, because it's almost like almost a stealth form of storytelling. You're advertising to people without actually making them feel advertised to, aren't you, to an extent, which is something I think that we need to be doing, or you need to be doing, in an environment where all of us are extremely time sensitive. So would you say that's a form of stealth storytelling or advertising, or is it something, I'm simplifying it a bit?
I guess, I would, in the land of agency speak, I would say that it's a good way of building value.
Well said.
But I don't know, I suppose from the perspective of Cameron and his clients is actually you need to kind of be a little bit stealth these days, because you're talking to a digitally aware audience who don't, that they understand the nature of marketing these days. Back in the day, people may not have been quite so aware or quite so savvy what you were trying to do to them or with them. But now they are very much aware that you're using their data, that you're driving them to particular things. And so actually, there does need to be some authenticity in the communication. There needs to be some genuineness around that story in order for people to necessarily want to engage with it, I think.
I think that people are you cannot be selling them a story that takes very long to tell either, I assume, because people are super time sensitive.
But also, I guess, if you're able to tell your story, but also to involve the person. So if it could be something as, I'm obviously improvising here, but if I'm telling you my story of how I was produced, why can't you tell me your story about how I'm being enjoyed? And why can't we enjoy this together? So how do you basically build that story with the consumer versus just shout messaging at them? I personally, I don't respond well to advertising. I don't really have the concentration span for it. And I'm definitely very, very cynical. But I think that it's, when you're talking about programmatic and everyone's saying, well, imagine if you can deliver dynamic banners to people based on them not seeing it, twice. I didn't want to see it the first time anyway. So it's it's one of those things where it's like, what we're really thinking about is not really anti-advertising, but it's like, what's the alternatives? And it definitely is anchored in storytelling, because it has to be, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're really speaking to this evolution of the digital generation and the YouTube generation, if you like, in as much as they have expectations, they understand the trade, they understand the exchange, and you're right, they want to have a stake in that storytelling process. Everybody wants to be able to engage and be able to put their stake in the ground and kind of say, what, this brand is mine, or I own a stake in the story of this brand, rather than just be told something. If they want to get broadcast, they'll just go to TV.
Well, it's really, I mean, what we're all talking about, I think, is something that's really core, which is interactivity, but also a sense of ownership. Because I think that stories, when in video games, this is one of the powers that a video game story has, is that if it's done well, you can have not just interactivity, but a sense of ownership. There are games out there, very famously the Mass Effect series, which really is it's a space opera. But you actually get to, participate in a way that makes your particular protagonist unique when compared to your friends. And I think that really buys you into things. And I think that's a sort of a principle that's universal from both storytelling in its pure form and advertising as well.
Absolutely. It occurs to me that our listeners may not be fully aware of what the Internet of Everything really means, or what the Internet of Things is.
I'm not sure I'm aware as well, so please do enlighten me.
And I thought, Cameron, perhaps you might like to explain from your perspective what it means to work with the Internet of Things, or to work with connected device, or a connected world, because I think there are a lot of people who might have a perception of things like wearables, for example, but that isn't necessarily connected things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I mean, what I don't do. Because what we don't do as businesses, we don't really talk about, I guess, the Internet of Everything, because we just we don't believe in confusing people.
You don't want to confuse our listeners.
Well, yeah. What I will try and do is I'll try and ground it in the context of the identity, or the progression of identity. And I'll start very mystical, and then I'll kind of make sense, hopefully, towards the end. So I mean, the evolution of the web has been fueled by identity. And if you look at brands, they had identities, they had websites. People then had identities, they had social network profiles. Then servers had identities, and people could buy stuff from digital brands. So this was all driven by identity. Now what's happened is that now things can have identities, whether it's a kettle or a wearable fitness device or a bottle of vodka or a fridge or a bottle of milk or whatever it is that you've got in your house or your store or your bar. All of these things can now have digital identities, whether they've got embedded connectivity that's got Wi-Fi connectivity that's able to send data up to the cloud, or a bottle that's got an NFC tag that can communicate intermittently with its identity in the cloud. Everything now has the opportunity to have web intelligence. So look around your room and imagine if any of those things had the ability, apart from your laptop, but imagine if those things had the ability to be as smart as you're used to from the web. That's really what the promise of the Internet of Things is. And I guess where people have been focusing more of their attention within the Internet of Things space is looking at business processes. So can my freight containers talk to my logistics tower and tell them where they are and what they've got inside them, for example? I guess what we're now exploring it from a marketing sense, saying, well, if everything around us can be connected, what types of value can we deliver through those connections? Is it services? Is it promotions? Is it exclusive content? All of those sorts of marketing things. And I guess that's really where we're approaching it.
I think
experiences.
Is the phrase. And
immersive experiences, right?
Yeah, well, I think the thing with the Internet of Things, so to speak, is that for a lot of people, a lot of consumers in the mainstream, it is this mystical thing that the businesses are using for something very complex, but they don't necessarily see that in their day-to-day lives or necessarily understand what it means for them. And I think we're just getting to that stage now with the Internet of Things where it's beginning to seep into more consumer-facing and kind of more mainstream applications, so people will begin to understand what it might do for them or how it might impact on their lives. And that's what agencies like yourself are doing with storytelling and really bringing to life that nature of the fact that anything could have its own digital identity and therefore can be part of the story. So I wanted to jump back for a moment, Merrick, because you were speaking earlier about different games that you're working with, and one of the hot topics at the moment, so I'm going to keep on banging on about it just because everybody keeps on talking to me about it, so I'm going to keep on talking to our listeners about it, is VR.
Okay, bring it on.
So, in the context of VR, because I think specifically for yourself, I'm curious to know if you have had any direct experience with or worked with any binaural experiences, because I think that's the piece that not a lot of people are talking about. They're talking about the visual experience of VR, but they're not talking about the importance of necessarily audio within that experience. And I'm curious if you've had any experiences with any binaural projects.
I do work closely. I mean, when you get a writer on the team and in a company, we're often working quite closely with the audio people. And I think the audio in video games is often, they're rather unsung heroes, to be honest.
Very overlooked.
They are. And, I used to grumble about being a writer and how people didn't appreciate story. Then I sat down and listened to a couple of audio people and I just shut up. Now it's like, oh, okay, I get it now. And I think that I will say that in terms of the audio elements of story, I have experience in terms of the VO and working on things like that, but I don't sit in a room and work with, 5.1 or 7.1 sort of tech that works on that. I did, however, have a good friend of mine actually sit down and tell me enthusiastically for 4 or 5 minutes what it was like to sit in his specially new sound room and actually hear an alien try and creep up behind him through a sound system, which actually does. And I think the thing that you're touching on right now is really important, is that a lot of people are talking about VR, and I do share a sort of cautious, sort of British excitement about it. So it's all very sort of
subdued fascination.
It is. It's like an anxious toe tap and maybe a slight tightening of my lips, and I'm sort of excited on the inside, right? But you also don't want to be disappointed, and I think that talking about the audio element of it will be vital, and it shouldn't be overlooked, because I think that hearing is one of the main ways in which we experience games and stories and things like that. And I think I currently don't have a particularly great sound system in my home gaming system, which is terrible. So I think that I'm not really, I don't think I'm really answering your question very satisfactorily, but I would say that audio is vital to the experience with 3D and immersive sort of gaming, and I think that's going to be something we're going to hear a lot more about over time. That was my joke. Joke.
British humour.
Sorry.
Hopefully our listeners are mostly British and they will understand your humour.
Yes, I don't think British people get it either. But I generally find myself working on several funny games at the moment, which is always tricky to say I'm funny, because then people will go, well, I'll show you how funny you're not. Don't laugh at anything you say after that.
Well, hopefully they will all get that. That's all good. But what I wanted to do, Cameron, was to talk a little bit more about what your thoughts are in terms of the future of VR, because it's great that the games industry seems to be very on top of it with VR. And I think that's mostly because when things like Oculus Rift kind of first emerged into the scene, it was very much a gaming vehicle. But now we're starting to hear more and more about other applications of VR, and especially about film and 360-degree film. Now, there are some people who shall remain unnamed who passionately believe that there is no such thing as 360 film. And then on the other flip side of that, there are people who definitely believe there is such a thing as 360 film. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, Cameron, from your perspective, from a marketing and brand perspective. What you think the application for something like, whether you want to call it 360 film or VR live action film, whatever you want to call it, whether or not you think there is an application for that going forwards for brands.
Yeah, I definitely think it's a more believable opportunity than Google Glass was. I think that's probably my starting point.
Okay.
Seems a fairly low bar.
I was going to say, that's a pretty low bar to be at.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I always remember the first time I saw someone in the street with Google Glass on. I didn't know whether to laugh or just go and attack them.
Take the lunch money off them, I think.
Yeah, sort of stamp on their VR or stamp on their Google Glass, laughing wildly.
Chaps, you're not giving a good impression here.
You're already. Sorry, you're already starting to see some really interesting uses of VR from a brand storytelling perspective. So allowing people to engage with live concerts from wherever they are in the world. I know that obviously, client plug absolute, even though it's not a project I worked on, did some really interesting stuff with 360 film as well. And I think that it's really giving people a great opportunity to participate in something which they otherwise wouldn't be able to. Like I said, for example, a festival or a concert or what have you. My issue, obviously, we're talking about the future when scale isn't a problem, but I'm not seeing signs of it really hitting the mass market yet. So it's still very much in the, I'm a brand, I want to do something with new technology. Let's hope for a bit of good user feedback. Let's hope for a good bit of press about it. I mean, I'm not seeing many opportunities to really move the dial.
You're saying that, but then people like New York Times have just announced that they're going to be releasing or delivering 1 million cardboard headsets, and that they're going to invest in a slate of films. And from a cardboard perspective, we know the cost and price point on cardboard is very accessible. You're talking about £15 to £20 or dollars, however you want to look at it, in terms of actually being able to obtain a headset. So I think perhaps, in an Oculus VR world or a Epsilon Cortex or Microsoft HoloLens world, perhaps that's going to be a bit further down the line. Perhaps that's going to be a little bit harder to achieve. But in terms of a mobile VR environment and using your mobile phone for VR and being able to drop that mobile phone into a cardboard device of some sort, I think that's definitely something that's becoming accessible and is going to become more accessible in the next 4 or 5 years. Do you not? Do you
fully?
think?
Yeah, absolutely. So where I interrupted on your house rules earlier and finished the story, I think you basically just got me back there. But no, I absolutely agree with you. And I said that. So what I was going to say was the steps are being taken to actually make this more accessible through stuff like Google Cardboard. I think even just as an immediate branding exercise, yes, create some content that can go on VR, and then also just handing out cardboards with logo, with a bit of content around it is obviously an excellent branding opportunity in itself. I guess the same with the stuff that we're working on, which is what we have to stop our clients doing or kind of have had to before, which is don't just jump in tech first. Don't just do VR because you want to do VR. Don't just do Internet of Things because you want to do IoT. Actually think about your consumer. Think about what license your brand has to talk or behave around that consumer, and then think about how you design, beautiful, interactive, valuable applications and services that are going to deliver positive business outcomes. I guess that's where we come at it from. We don't try and go headfirst into stuff. And I'm definitely not an expert in VR. So.
I fully agree with you, and as much as I still think that that's particularly applicable to just the basics like mobile. When a client comes to me and says, "Oh, let's do a mobile app," or let's have a mobile experience. The first question really ought to be why.
Yeah, I'd actually add to that. I mean, I think you guys are. You're absolutely right. But I'd go back to a comment that you made earlier, Tanya, which was, that the games industry seem very on top of it when it comes to VR. And I can completely understand why you would say that, because, we are, three-dimensionality, as it were, has been in the games industry for a long time. However, I would say that while there are some what maybe you'd call page one applications for it, so you can imagine popping on a headset and running around shooting aliens for an hour or so. There's functionality that's very obvious about VR for video games, but there's also, I think, the interesting stuff's going to happen when it's really penetrated the market properly, when it's not even about thinking about cardboard and stuff like that everyone and their dog has a headset like you would have, a monitor. And I also think that the exciting time is going to be with the stuff that we haven't thought of yet, the applications that are such that when they get created, it's a real head slap moment of why didn't I think of that? But that's going to be, for me as a storyteller and as a gamer, it's going to be the exciting time, I think, is the stuff we don't think of right now.
Having said that, and I know because you've listened to a couple of our podcasts, you may have listened to a recent episode where actually the experts on that call decided that VR was not necessarily the future. They had a hypothesis, which was that VR was actually more of a staging arena for what would come next, which they believe will be AR. So I'd be curious.
AR, sorry to interrupt, but AR?
Augmented reality.
Oh, I see. Right. Sorry. I knew
versus
that.
virtual reality.
I'm down with it. Instead
of being in the black box environment of putting a black box on your head, being able to interact and see that environment around you. So, for example, we recently saw Magic Leap's video of their lovely little, universe and the earth spinning and all that jazz out on a table, on somebody's desk. And everybody can see that experience. So it's not an insular experience anymore. It's a shared experience. And suddenly that changes the nature of our environment around us. And I'm curious to hear from your perspective, Cameron, what your thoughts are on this from both a commercial kind of application basis, but also just from a technological basis in terms of do you think that will be something that's more easily adopted because of that shared experience?
I mean, I wouldn't say I agreed with either of those points. I definitely think in a gaming context, right? So Call of Duty. I mean, I don't particularly want to see my kitchen turn into a battlefield from Call of Duty, right? I want to go into a Call of Duty game and sit down and not speak to anyone for 9 hours and just shoot people, right? So,
you may have a gaming problem.
Or he's just getting it right. That's how everyone does it.
Exactly. Yeah. Just proudly socially awkward. I think from my perspective, coming from a mobile background, augmented reality has generally been used awfully because you still had to use an interface into an augmented world, right? You had to go through your mobile device.
Your mobile with the frame, basically.
Exactly. But the thing is, with Magic Leap, you still have to wear a headset or a visual augmentation tool or whatever you want to call it, right? So creating a distinction between VR and AR based on the fact that one happens in the space and one happens elsewhere, I don't think is a particularly strong argument, because they're two completely different use cases. I guess from my perspective, from working with brands, when everyone talks about the internet of fridge, the internet of things drives me insane, because everyone talks about, your fridge is going to be able to order your milk or whatever. We've been talking about that for like 15 years or something. I think it was like 1990 something when the first actual fridge with genuinely like a fridge with an interface came
I think
round.
You're right.
Yeah. So, it's like we have to move past discussions around potential use cases and go into actually thinking about what the brand's role is on that platform. And the brand's role on an AR platform is completely different to a brand's role in a VR platform, for example. Yeah. The same way the brand's role within the home is going to be different from the brand's role within a bar. So we're not really trying to create overlaps between the different platforms. We're trying to actually create distinctions, but then also, which is the most critical part, understand how all of those different points join up together. So all of the activity that we're doing with our brands, we're making sure that it's all feeding into one consistent tool that allows them to be able to analyze the engagements, the analytics and the insights, and be able to use that more intelligently in the future. So I guess that's I don't know if that answered your question, but
I think that told me.
No, I think that's a very valid way of putting it, actually. I think it's down to, but it's also down to accessibility. We're incredibly I think that if something is difficult, like I grumble going in to see a 3D movie, having to put glasses on, and I think that's something as technology becomes more transparent, really. And I think, Google Glasses being a terrible example, because of course it literally is transparent, but it's not good enough.
You're talking about that frictionless engagement.
Exactly. It's like having a phone. When I want to check the weather, it takes me 3 seconds on my phone. I don't even think about the moment. By the time I finish thinking about it, it is done. When it comes to interactivity in virtual environments, I think that when we get to the stage where it will be that easy to do, then it's going to be interesting. Until then, it's going to be still, I think, the purview of those of us or those people who are way more engaged and have are more eager to jump in, quite literally.
As early adopters, as digital natives.
Exactly.
I do think you're right, and I think that there is this kind of requirement, and it's been said before in this podcast that a lot of the guests have said that they don't believe that things like AR or VR or this kind of next generation of technology is necessarily going to be mainstream adopted until we remove the barriers to entry, and that does tend to be around slapping a big headset on your head or having to hold up your mobile phone or whatever that thing is that causes that friction. But I do think that we're getting closer to the right technology that can help to deliver that. I saw an article not so long ago about contact lenses that can be delivered into the eye that can just literally be put in with a wash rather than laser surgery, but that can give us 20/20 vision, that hardened lens that unfolds on the eye once you wash it into the eye. And so when we think about that kind of technology and it being able to just be something as simple as an eye wash that delivers a lens into our eye that can then allow that augmentation, the bionic future isn't that far away.
Perhaps. I think technology is an amazing thing. But I think that the basic principle, I think that maybe we're all agreeing on, I don't know, Cameron, if you would, is that I think that it's a ways away before things like Oculus Rift will, or things of that nature will really be readily available to anyone but those of us willing to pay the high price and also the pain in the backsideness of actually, experiencing
it. Setting it up as well.
Exactly.
But I'm gonna follow up on your point here, Marek, which is I find it interesting because obviously we as people who work within this industry and doing what we do are very much on the front edge. And as you say, Marek, we are the early adopters, the people who are going to go out there and get that new technology before anybody else. But we're also the people that are going to come up with the use cases or potentially create this new technology. And I'm curious to hear both of your points on this in terms of, do you think that we as the front line, if you like, have a moral and ethical obligation to safeguard the development and the kind of the direction that this technology is taking? Because there are a lot of things that are happening, and they're happening at a very rapid pace. And there isn't really a huge amount of I'm not going to say policing, but guidance, shall we say, in terms of what these things should and shouldn't be doing. And
technology moves very fast, and we can't keep up with it legally, can we? Really, because it moves a lot quicker than the ability for the the various legal institutions to keep up with it. Sorry, I interrupted.
So, but on that basis, does it become our responsibility as the people working within these fields, as the people adapting to this technology? Is it our responsibility to ensure that those things are being not necessarily policed, but guided and held to accountability? In a way that by the time they get to these mainstream audiences, we've helped to ensure that we're not drilling into everybody's personal life and inserting things into the brain and what have you, because we've allowed people to get so far ahead of themselves. Is it our responsibility, do you feel, to ensure that moral and ethical obligation?
Well, I take it. I imagine that both Cameron and I have got things to say about this, and I suppose from my standpoint, in terms of an ethical obligation, I think that there's a lot of stuff that goes around about the internet and how, about video gaming and how we do have, a situation in our hands with children playing things like Call of Duty and Grand Theft Auto and all these sorts of things. And should we, because that's a bad thing. I think that when it comes to content creation of any kind, I think the principles are pretty universal, whether you're writing a book or penning a film or doing a video game. I think it's on us as a society to create a system, a structure through which content is labeled as suitable for, certain age ranges. So I'll say that's one thing I'd say about it. The other is I think it also behooves us as a society to teach ourselves and our children and students and things critical thinking, the ability to analyze what is put before you, especially in this ocean of information that we currently, paddle through and drown in every day now compared to, back in the 80s and 90s. So I think first of all, we need to, in terms of as a creator, I look at the needs of the project I'm working on, and working on a game like Killing Floor 2, which basically is a huge decapitation simulator with rock music in the back or metal music in the background and people shouting obscenities and chopping monsters' heads off. I don't have any problem doing, writing what needs to be written because it's an 18 game, as it should be. Whereas a game like Fable Legends, which is also a game about combat, but it's a much more gentle and sort of amiable British experience. But they're both labelled as such as suitable for certain kinds of content. So but we need to think critically as well. So I've rambled on, and I don't know what Cameron thinks about that.
Hey, well, I'm definitely getting the vibe that you're slightly more intelligent than I am.
Thanks.
Don't tell him things like
that,
that's
Cameron. Not true.
Don't tell him things like that.
I know. I'm just sitting here with my massive head now.
So it doesn't fit on the Skype webcam anymore. It's the ego's exploded. But I guess from a brand perspective, I'm sure there's a lot of brands that would tell you that there's consumers out there that want to drill things into their brain, so they're constantly wired into their brand's Facebook page or something. And obviously that's part and parcel of the marketing sphere, unfortunately. But I think that when I guess there's two things. One is in the application development or the concept development stage, we always involve that brand's consumers into the process. So help them with the brainstorming, do some stuff on Post-it notes, ask them what they think about it. If you don't like it, what would you change? Why do you like that? How would you build on it? So we try and make them part of it because we think that actually it's not our job to be able to tell them what they want. It's about co-creation. The second thing is about the privacy element that you guys mentioned around, what data, and obviously in a more connected world, we're going to have more and more opportunities to use data. And I think that the main thing that we advocate is complete transparency. So there is no reason, absolutely none at all, why a brand should not be saying to a consumer, this is the data that we're going to collect from this touch point on you. This is how we're going to use it. This is how we might use it in the future. This is how we're never, ever going to use it in the future. Because that's just going to build instant trust and ease of mind. I don't have the Facebook app. I was very, very close to quitting Spotify until they launched Discover Weekly, which almost brings me to tears every Monday with how good it is. So it's like when people are open about the data that they're going to be using on you, and they're using it in a proper way, and they're not abusing the trust, then actually I think that's absolutely fine. So I think as long as you involve them in the processes, and as long as you tell them exactly what you're doing with their data, I think that's kind of the future that we should be working towards.
Interesting. One of the things that you bring up there is around privacy, and we actually had this conversation previously on another episode where it was put forth as a theory that actually in the next decade or so, the next generation, the 2 and 3 year olds who are playing with the iPad right now, they're going to get to a stage where actually privacy is no longer something that really means anything to them. So the concept was very much around this notion that actually in the future, young people will not mind the idea that people are using their data because they'll assume it's okay. They'll assume that that's normal because we are moving towards this societal future where actually all of our data is being utilized all of the time. Right now, at this very moment in time, we all have this wonderful thing in our pocket called a smart mobile phone that is telling the certain people a huge amount of information about us, whether that is how fast we're moving, whether we're walking, whether we're in a car, what altitude we're at, a vast array of data that can be used in various interesting ways. It's just one of those things that we have a particular perception, our generation has a particular perception around privacy that I don't think the next generation is necessarily going to have. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this one.
The funny thing is that the thing we should not do for this conversation is any presentation or conference you go to and they ask this question, the person always stops and looks really contemplative and then goes, actually, it really depends on the value exchange. And everyone goes, yeah. And then kind of the question's just completely avoided. So actually we should try and answer it this time. The Snowden revelations. How many people do you know left Facebook when they were aware that all of our data was being taken and crunched by government agencies and used for nefarious purposes? I think it's a very, very small number. So I think this kind of pre-nostalgia about, we're the last guardians of privacy, I think is actually slightly incorrect, because I think that actually we as people generally, as a population, don't care that much about our privacy anyway. I try not to have the conversation about the next generation. Actually, I think about this generation, and I think that there is evidence that people aren't as particular about taking ownership over their data as we perhaps think.
Interesting. That could be a good Twitter poll to have right there. Do we care about privacy? What's your thoughts on this one, Marek?
I think it's really a tricky one. When I did my, I'm going to sound quite swotty. I did my dissertation on information warfare at university. And I think that in terms of privacy, I think actually Cameron's right in a lot of ways. I think that I didn't leave Facebook when I heard about the Snowden revelations. It didn't surprise me at all, to be honest, because there have been all sorts of things in the background that have happened over the years. But I would say that, for example, I'm a good example, I think, of someone typical who I limit my interactivity with things like Facebook to things that I'm only happy. I take the principle that I wouldn't post anything or say anything that I wouldn't be happy to have on a cork board somewhere in the middle of the high street, and I think that that's something. But I'm also really glad that I'm not 15 and have access to Twitter, because God knows the sort of stuff I'd have come out with, kind of emo rubbish and sort of terrible poetry and thoughts that I think were brilliant. But I'd say that the other thing I'd say is that the idea of, back in the Victorian era, they had this idea of, in fact, it's not just the Victorian, but the idea of the panopticon as a structure in which everything can be seen, right? And there are all sorts of dystopian books about panopticons, and prisons have been panopticons, so structures in which no one can hide from one another. I think that we do live in an era or we're in danger of being in a digital panopticon, not to sound too worthy, because it does sound so worthy to put it that way, but I do think of it as such. Like when you see pictures of Victorian prison, which has basically all the prisoners, no one can hide from the jailer in the middle. I do feel that digitally, I view my life online as that, for better or for worse. And I think that, and therefore I do, George R.R. Martin was sort of interviewed a few months ago and said that, he basically works on like a computer that's like 30 years old and wouldn't know the internet if it smacked it on the arse. He works on an ancient computer, and I think that there's something in me that makes me want to, I use paper and pencil sometimes if I want something to be truly private. And I think there's a lot to that. But I also think we are desensitized to it. And I think Cameron's right, sadly, even though I think I'm probably one of the people who is a bit more cautious than maybe the average Facebook user.
And I was going to say, I think that's because we are professionally experienced in areas where we know what we're looking out for. Okay, we're a lot more conscious of how people are using data, because I think we actually have an interest in it. I think a lot of people just do not care. A lot of people will look at a garden chair on Google and then be watching a video and then see a garden chair advertised next to it and go, this is fantastic. It's like,
they know. It's amazing.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's kind of like, I think we're the kind of the minority, I guess, when it comes to being more aware about how our data's being used.
We're happy to sell pieces of ourselves. That's what we're doing. We're selling pieces of our background, and I won't be so dramatic or melodramatic to say pieces of our soul, but I think selling little bits of ourselves is something I feel uncomfortable about, to be honest. But I do think that you're right, that we are maybe more aware of it than other. That might have also led, student me to actually look into, information warfare and stuff, because it's a hot topic. It's not going away.
I think it's interesting though that you're kind of bringing this up, because I do think that there is this interesting evolution, if you like, where I'm pretty sure I heard recently that they're going to introduce social media studies to 15-year-olds, that age range, because there is this lack of education, if you like, around the impact or the long-term impact of having social media in your life. These kids who are out there posting all sorts of things on their Facebooks and their Twitter accounts, and then when they go to get their first job and the first thing their new employer does is actually check them out on social media, it's like they're not really being educated on the dangers or the fact that there's so many suicides, for example, around this idea that young people feel very personally attached and emotionally attached to digital identity. And when that digital identity is challenged or threatened, so, somebody outs them, for example, on social media for being whatever it is, or somebody does something that's detrimental to their digital image, that they feel that is just the end of their life. And that there was a spate of youth suicides based on the idea that these youths just could not cope with the idea that their digital identities had been compromised in such a way.
I'll just sort of say, and this is something I think that's more Cameron's bag than mine, to be honest. But I think that one of the things I've become aware of is that we, as a writer, as someone who's, I work in writing and I work with stories and in, day out, I've become how aware of the fact. I had a professor once tell me that we were studying meteorology. He said, "Oh no, we live in a sea of air," and I thought that's an interesting way of looking at it. And I realised in society we live in an ocean of stories. Every day is woven up of myriad stories that sort of, some are fiction, some are non-fiction. It's difficult to tell the difference. And Cameron and I both deal in narrative, obviously. But I think that what's scary is that we have become far more accessible characters on a digital landscape now, due to the fact that back in the 80s, if you could make a phone call and say something stupid, or someone could ring you up and say something mean or be mean to you in the playground. These days, there's that lack of travel distance for someone to contact your character on the digital sphere and say something mean, true or untrue about you. And that's quite scary. I think it's interesting, the landscape we live in now as opposed to, years ago. But this is what Cameron and I make our money off, I think, as well. So there's a positive to it too, is my point.
Yeah, long may it continue.
Yeah, I know, hooray.
No, I think there's also, I think it's also a symptom of kind of the wider media landscape. And I think everyone now, if you look at the crap that's on TV, everyone's fly-on-the-wall documentary about, Kim Kardashian, or The Only Way is Essex, The Only Way is Sussex, all these different programs where it just basically gives people the aspiration to feel like they're living their life as if everyone else is watching them. And I think that social media is possibly the worst thing for that, because they have what they believe is a captive audience. So they're almost taking those learnings, applying them to social media. And I also think the way you're talking about social media impacting suicides or what have you, I think that those people generally have mental frailties that would have exposed themselves elsewhere anyway. So I think it's just a sign of the times, if I'm being honest with you. That it's not, but even with the Internet of Things, and we talk about artificial intelligence and machine learning, if you look at all the films that are coming, well, not all the films, but a lot of the films that are coming out now, they're dealing with those topics. They're dealing with, the Joaquin Phoenix film Her, the idea that he enters into almost like a romantic or
there's no almost, it was a romantic relationship.
Yes, it was.
Well, I called it romantic, but I was applying some sort of physical sense to the word romantic. But I guess we could call it romantic. But he enters into a relationship with basically an AI. So we're tackling these topics, and I think, and it's really interesting to actually see about the evolution of kind of Hollywood and how actually society is mirroring that as well. I'm not sure how we got onto that topic from social media, but I guess it's just a sign of the times, I guess.
No, but I find this really interesting, because the other hot topic at the moment, aside from, if it doesn't have initials, nobody seems to want to talk about it with me at the moment, but it's either AR, VR or AI.
I introduced myself as CW now.
That's the trinity at the moment that everybody's speaking to me about. But AI is actually becoming quite an interesting topic at the moment. And I think there's a lot of investment in this space at the moment. And a lot of people who are exploring it and trying to do interesting things. And so the future that we saw in the film Her is actually not that far away. I don't know about you guys, but you may not have noticed that you were scheduled for this podcast by Amy Ingram.
Yeah, I know what you're going to say now. Carry on.
Well, Amy isn't human.
Yeah, actually, to be fair, it took me one exchange to figure that out, to be honest. But I'm also a deeply suspicious individual. So, and also, words are my thing. So a couple of, but I think that Amy as a personal digital assistant is interesting, but then the minute you throw her a curveball off the flowchart,
she's not going to cope with a curveball at this stage. But interestingly, I think this is where people are starting to invest a little bit of time and energy and research into, just trying to create that humanistic experience. And to be fair, for people who aren't as suspicious as either of you guys are, a lot of people haven't realised. It takes for me to point out to them that Amy isn't human for them to necessarily notice that she isn't human. And
this is where I own up to having a Joaquin Phoenix moment with your personal assistant.
Be flirting with her. That would be great. Yeah.
Oh bless you! Okay, you've been chatting up Amy. I shall have to tell X.AI. They will be most happy to know this. But no, I mean the notion that we're getting into that AI future, the concept of being able to have a network of artificial agents who are taking care of these really quite minutiae of detail things to allow us or to facilitate us to be able to be more productive and to kind of get on with life, so to speak, is quite interesting. And I find that the more that we look at what we're seeing coming from what I would call near science or cutting edge science, sci-fi films is actually not far off the mark. We're seeing a lot of this stuff very much making it into the beta stage or experimental stage, certainly in the landscape of what we're seeing right now.
Do you really? I mean, I have to say that I remember one of the first projects I worked on. I was talking to one of the programmers about the game's AI, and I said to him, "So, what's the AI like?" And he said, "Well, it's really more A than I." And I think I liked his frankness. I appreciated that. I think at the moment, my personal feeling is, and I think it's something that's very exciting in theory, and I think that things are coming on and technology is accelerating, etc. And putting aside all sort of doomsayers who think that we might all be annihilated the minute things get too intelligent, I do think at the moment my personal feeling is that what artificial intelligence is of sort of Amy's type is really just a slightly elaborate flowchart. That's my feeling, which actually is still very useful. Absolutely, it's just the real test of it will be. If I was ever to, in say 5 years' time, you booked an appointment with me through something like Amy, and then I threw a few curveballs at her and was still unsure as to whether I was actually dealing with an assistant that was virtual or not. That at the moment it takes minimal effort to uncover it, I think. But I know there are programs out there that are far more sophisticated, of course.
Well, I think that there are a lot of people who are putting a lot of brain power into it, and I think that certainly we've heard from Apple that they're going to be investing in Siri. We know that Cortana is having a lot of investment right now, and there is that next generation of AI that's starting to emerge, and I think people are really interested in where they can take it. So I'm curious to see where it ends up. I'm definitely curious to see where it ends up, but I do think that for some of those folk who are not necessarily quite as digitally minded or as suspicious as the likes of us, I think for them...
Inquisitive. That's a nicer way of putting it.
I think for them, the future is already here. I think there's a lot of stuff that they think is purely sci-fi in the films, it's in the movies, it's not real life. But the reality is actually, yeah, it is. It's real life, it's here, and we are utilising some of these things. And sure, they might be a bit crude, and they still have a long way to go, but the fundamentals are actually, something that we are, toying around with and exploring around the edges.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is interesting and it is exciting. I love being able to tell, ask my phone to do a countdown from 10 minutes and stuff if I'm, cooking something and stuff like that. And I'm sure that there are many, many ways in which you can use the current level of technology in ways that are way more interesting than helping you cook some pasta, you sound like a heathen.
But on that note, I am going to ask you this, and this is a question that we ask at the end of every Digital Jam session, which is to understand from you what you think is going to be the most significant shift or change in the next 5 to 10 years that will have an impact or significant impact on your industry, on the face of your industry and how you operate? Whether that's a technological change, whether that's a cultural shift, whatever that thing may be, I'm curious to understand what you think is going to be the big change for you and your industry. And let's start with you, Cameron.
Damn, I thought you were going to go to Merrick.
No such luck.
I'm making notes.
That never works out for me, those sorts of things. I guess I think maybe if I can say two things, that'll be all right.
Yes, of course.
So we focus on two main areas. So these are the two areas that I'm more kind of focused and knowledgeable on. The first one is smart packaging. So looking at how packaging becomes interactive and is able to deliver stuff to consumers. And I think that printed electronics is really coming on leaps and bounds. And I think that the ability to now print stuff like antennas and batteries and stuff like that is actually really, really interesting, because you can now reimagine any physical product in the whole world as being able to not just come as a physical object, but come with a layer of digital services around it, without sounding too much like a marketing idiot. I've got a good second one, actually, because I just came to me.
You're almost making this up.
I had a pretty weak one, and now it's literally just come to me like a thunderbolt or lightning bolt. So there's now companies that can take signals from the air and turn those into energy that can then charge batteries. So you now don't need to charge certain devices based on the fact that all of the available signals in the air can now be recycled. And I think that in terms of just really things like, clean air or generally clean tech or Bluetooth low energy devices that have always needed powering, that's going to progress the Internet of Things industry massively. And if you wanted a name, check out a company called FreeVolt, because they're kind of they've got the patents in the industry as well. I'm really excited by their technology.
Does LiFi come into that arena of interesting tech for you?
Lithium ion?
No, LiFi. They're calling it LiFi instead of Wi-Fi. So Wi-Fi being transferred via light.
Wow, I haven't heard of this.
Oh, yes. It's a new thing.
Oh.
They're calling it LiFi, apparently.
It's very swanky, and I think Cameron and I are both a little bit flat-footed on that one.
I'm going to call that 2B.
All right, then. So moving on to you, Marek. What do you think will be your significant change?
I mean, to be honest, I'm going to go for 2 as well, seeing as, Cameron got 2. So we're all going to be equal. Well, I'd say VR is an obvious one. I think that anything that can really submerge you in a landscape is inherently exciting for me. I think there are still significant sort of barriers really to that, and beyond even things like Oculus Rift, etc. But I think that VR is exciting, and I think that's going to be really interesting. I think for me, though, I think sophisticated procedural storytelling is probably what I would really hope is going to come. And by that, I mean video game landscapes where, this happens to an extent, of course, already, where the landscape reacts to you in a way, from a player's actions, whether you're driving a car or shooting a gun or talking to people, the landscape does react to you. But I think at the moment we can up that level of sort of sophistication so that you actually can take part in a story that shapes itself around you in more meaningful ways than even currently happens now. I think that's somewhere that would excite me. And I know that there are people who feel that we already have this, but I think that we actually have it, but in kind of a crayon drawing version. I think it'd be really nice to see some, fine brushes broken out digitally, and that we have a universe that maybe even the final goal changes depending on what you've done in ways that we haven't seen yet. And linked to that, I'm excited about, to be honest, better writing in video games. I think that it's a craft that we're all just still learning, and I think it's an exciting one, but I also think that the quality level varies greatly, whereas in a film it doesn't vary as much as you might think in some ways. And I think video game storytelling, the quality of it, the quality of the content and the writing needs to continue to go up, in a more sort of even spread, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does absolutely make sense. And I think it's very interesting because I think there is generalistically almost a desire for the games industry to become a little bit more linear in the way that it tells its stories, and to have a clearer architecture for the story. So things like Last of Us and and the new Tomb Raider reboot, things like that.
Oh, that's a huge can of worms there. You basically just said the thing that you would say at the beginning of a 2-hour podcast. The short answer is there is an argument for that. There's an argument for both types of storytelling, and they're both good, to be honest, linear and non-linear in their own ways. They've both got their strengths.
Maybe I should have started with that.
I think it's an interesting point, and I think that I certainly think The Last of Us as a game, for example, is fantastic, but I think it delivers a certain experience as opposed to a game where you are dropped into the proverbial sandpit and are left to have at it.
Oh, well, it's definitely not a sandbox experience. So I think that's very much, the difference in types of gameplay. I think it is very different. But I do think that there is an interesting crossover arena happening at the moment where TV is trying to become more interactive and to a certain extent, certain types of games, AAA, particular types of games are trying to become a little bit more linear. So I think there's an interesting crossover point there. And in terms of packaging, I think that we're getting to a really interesting stage. And I don't know whether or not touchprint is one of those things that you've been exploring, Cameron, or not, but I do think there's something very interesting there with touchprint that nobody's quite really found the proper use for it yet, but I'd be interested to see where that goes as well.
Was that a question or was that a statement?
That was just a statement. That was just
bit of both.
Statement.
In which case I agree wholeheartedly.
You're a wise man.
So, gentlemen, what we'd normally like to do for our listeners is to let them know what your social media handle of choice is so that they can follow you, find out a little bit more about what you do, stalk you, whatever it is they might want to do. So, Marek, what would be your social media handle of choice?
Well, after all this stuff I've been banging on about social media, the panopticon of evil, I do occasionally tweet on @MarekWalton. So that's what I do. And I am occasionally on Facebook, but I don't use it. It's just for my close friends. So Twitter is the best way for me to reach out to me if you ever want to say hello and be nice and not be mean. Yeah. There you go.
Basically, don't follow you unless you're going to be nice.
Yes, exactly. Well, I think that should be every single Twitter account should have that at the top. Just be nice and hug each other digitally.
And Cameron, what would be your social media handle of choice?
We're still figuring out social media here at Sharpend. I think we're living too far in the future. So we've got something like, I think it's like 65 Twitter followers or something. So if you can join the crusade and try and get me up to at least 100 or something credible, then it's at Agency of Things.
Agency of Things. Wonderful. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us on this digital jam session today. And if you enjoy this kind of content and you enjoyed what you heard today, then please do remember to subscribe and review. And thanks again for joining us on this digital jam session. digitaljamsessions.com